CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy. After 2 years and more than 80 episodes of our Conversations on African Philanthropy, we are introducing a series of conversations that are theme-specific, program-focused, and at times recorded at the request of those at the coalface of implementation in order to document and tell their experiences and stories. In the first of such series, we focus on the Zimbabwe Alliance Initiative, whose grants, convenings, capacity building, and technical support have fostered a vibrant civil society, where partners were empowered to design innovative and coordinated responses that amplify the voices of those marginalized, influence the capacity of citizens to mobilize around national critical issues, engage with policymakers, and built regional and international solidarity in pursuit of a better Zimbabwe. Formed in 2010 to strengthen the role of civil society in influencing Zimbabwe's transition to democracy, the Alliance has evolved over several phases to what it is today. An initiative of several partners, Zimbabwe Alliance is a story of resilience, innovation, dedication, and passion expressed somewhat beautifully in some of the least expected places and ways.
Welcome to an episode that is focusing on the Zimbabwe Alliance, an initiative that was put together by a couple of donors, among them the Wallace Global Fund, way back at the time when Zimbabwe was, in a way, experimenting with the government of national unity. Some of the objectives of the fund and the alliance at the beginning was to strengthen civil society in a country that was meant to be going through a transition, but secondly, to provide re-granting facilities. Among those that were involved in the early beginnings of the initiative is Dorsey, the former executive director of the Wallace Global Fund and currently the senior advisor of the fund. Ellen, welcome to the conversations.
Thank you, Becky. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. As we start, obviously this is a series that we are doing on Zim Alliance in an attempt to document the interventions, the experiences, the lessons, and as one of the people, but also one of the foundations of funds that were involved in the early beginnings of the initiative, I'm keen to get the history of the emergence of the initiative from one of the founders. I mean, part of what we have discovered is that there's very little written around the early beginnings of the initiative. And so it's been useful speaking to people like Cynthia, people like Briggs, and now we are very much excited to speak to you because you were one of the very first people to have this conversation and conceptualize the alliance. So maybe talk to us a bit about the history and how it came about, and then we can talk about the initial objectives, at least from the perspective of the fund.
Great, happy to do it. So I should say that Wallace Global Fund is a private family philanthropy based in Washington, D.C. Our donor was Henry Wallace, who was Vice President of the United States under FDR, an architect of the New Deal, and really an amazing champion of movements and progressive social change. And that's a fantastic DNA for our work. And the foundation's priorities are democracy, human rights, environment, and corporate accountability, women's rights and corporate accountability. And we had a kind of deep presence in South Africa, a country that I also had. I've had a long history of work in solidarity and living there. And so we had a pretty deep presence in South Africa, although no staff there. And we began to see both new opportunity and challenges in Zimbabwe, and wanted to figure out how we could play a supportive role in building out civil society's capacity to respond to the challenges, to respond to the new opportunities to promote democracy and human rights there. So in 2009, Wallace Global Fund helped establish the Zimbabwe Alliance as what we saw as being a unique model of funder civil society collaboration to support and grow the grassroots movement for democracy and human rights in Zimbabwe. And we saw this opportunity as a way of also addressing and augmenting our own capacity to do meaningful and appropriate work in country. And so we began in the earliest days partnering with a historic African solidarity organization based in the United States called Africa Action. Africa Action emerged out of two organizations that had been vital anti-apartheid leaders for decades in the United States. And Briggs Bamba was a staff person there, Briggs, from Zimbabwe. And we built a relationship and said we had already been funding Africa Action for the solidarity work, but we said we really felt like we could begin to get resources through Africa Action to Zimbabwe with Briggs's partnership and guidance. Then some changes happened at Africa Action, and Briggs had made the decision to return to Zimbabwe. So we started looking for a different model to do regranting and support under Briggs's leadership. We reached out to Trust Africa, and Professor Becky Moyo happened to be working there at the time. And so we began designing what became the Zim Alliance. And some of the resources that we had been programming through Africa Action, we now began to program through Trust Africa. So why did we do this? And why did we go about setting up the Zimbabwe Alliance? I think it's largely the first reason was the need and the opportunity, and that there was very little philanthropic money going to Zimbabwe. And what would go to Zimbabwe was largely going to big NGOs in the major cities or solely in Harare. And we knew from our work in the United States and around the world that that is not getting to communities in the way that it needs to. It's not going to building out deep knowledge and commitment to democracy and human rights and lifting up leaders, often not funded or resourced, who are doing the work in their communities, the transformative economic, social, and political work in their communities. So we wanted first and foremost to ensure that our resources went to community organizing and advocacy, economic and political education, nonpartisan voter education, cultural and artistic means of organizing, and get closer to the ground and further out, as it were, from the capital. And we also knew that we wouldn't have a capacity there. So we wanted, for a funder based in the US, no staff in Southern Africa, we wanted to make sure that that work was being programmed by someone who knew Zimbabwe, had deep relationships in Zimbabwe, and frankly was an organizer funder, because that's really what we were are. So we also felt we wouldn't be the only funder that wanted that kind of capacity and wanted to learn from what was happening. We were willing to experiment. We wanted to learn from what was happening on the ground. And we felt like it would be valuable to build out a table of like-minded donors who could learn from each other, learn from the work, and organize other funders to come in, because we knew that our resources would be relatively small and the need was so great, so little money was going to Zimbabwe that that table could be a way to grow the resources, mobilize more resources. In fact, fast forward, at some point in the journey on the Zim Alliance, we even engaged a consultant to try and organize more money into the Zim Alliance, because in my efforts to reach out to larger donors, we often heard that they weren't interested in putting money into Zimbabwe because it was not considered a transitional country, meaning a country that was sufficiently in a process that would lead to an established democracy. That was a shocking realization for me, that funders that worked on human rights, worked on democracy, didn't think Zimbabwe had a chance and therefore weren't willing to put money into the country. That seemed almost immoral. So that just intensified our commitment to building out a kind of donor, civil society, collaborative, or at least a community of practice, of knowledge generation, of collaboration and sharing.
Yeah, so I mean, on that point on donors and the attempts to bring more donors, maybe let's take a back step a bit and talk about how, in the beginning, you were able to work with the Schooner Foundation, IDEX, and I think there was the Jewish Service as well there. How does that collaboration come about?
Yeah, great. Happy to give our memory of that and our experience of that. So as we began this experiment, willing to launch this experiment of deeper regranting, community organizing in Zimbabwe, we began to reach out to some like-minded donors, or donors that had already been working, supporting a few partners in Zimbabwe. So IDEX, which became Thousand Currents, led at that time by Vinny, the Schooner Foundation, and Trust Africa, we began to form the management of the Zim Alliance. We began to interact as that community of practice. And I would say, as we began recruiting a few core funders and helped set up the steering committee for the Zim Alliance, which Becky was involved in, we also began, we supported Briggs, and our board chair, Scott Wallace, and his wife, Christy, traveled to Zimbabwe on a fact-finding mission. They set up meetings with civil society leaders on the ground, government officials, journalists, foreign embassies, etc., to kind of map out what both the challenges and the opportunities were. The first grant we made that went through Trust Africa, once we had shifted support from Africa Action, was to create a short educational video about the situation on the ground, to hire Briggs, provide staff capacity. And we felt that educational materials was a good way to recruit other donors, as well as be used as an organizing tool to really elevate the profile of what was happening in Zimbabwe. So that first grant led to an over 15-year partnership with Trust Africa, where we've provided 20 up to 25 grants with close to 2.5 million in funding.
Yeah, and of course, you started speaking about some of the lessons around trying to bring other new donors to the fold. And my reading of the records right now is that you remained as the only donor that remained supporting Zim Alliance. Of course, Trust Africa was matching some of the grants, but I think there's only one moment where maybe there's a small grant that came from All Media, but otherwise you remained the only donor, supporting Zim Alliance. maybe let's talk about why you stayed when others actually stopped.
Well, that's a great question, and I will refrain from reflecting on the philanthropic sector and some of the challenges with it. But if you approach your philanthropic work in a difficult tension between being humble and wanting to invest in and believe in a trust-based approach to your work, i.e., supporting your partners to experiment, understanding that they know what they're doing, and at times you're going to learn things that work and don't work, and that to do that, you have to have a long-term and durable relationship. They have to have the knowledge that your support is going to be long-term, and they also need to know that you're going to be a comrade funder. And what does that mean? That means at times, sure, you give operating support, long-term operating support. You're willing to experiment, but at other times you get the call that they need X, Y, and Z, immediate security assistance, an opportunity to plan something that could lead to a constitutional change process, which is something our funding helped support. You make more funds available. And so I think other funders kind of came in and out based upon their own interests or their own governance issues, their own resources, but we tried to stay in that durable comrade funder role.
Great. Thank you so much. And I want us to maybe start talking about some of the milestones and some of the results of the alliance. So, like you said, at the beginning, the idea was to really support the variety of civil society organizations, starting around 2009, and of course, some of the first grants that we have going directly to the country around 2011. And so, one of the clusters that I've been following a lot is the constitution writing, which is really around democracy building and helping civil society to make inputs into the new constitution. And a lot seems to have been achieved there. We spoke to a number of groups in Zimbabwe that were involved, who were explaining some of the direct interventions, but also some of the indirect interventions around how they did that. I don't know, based on your own experience, your own reflections, and maybe discussions with some of the partners, what from your perspective has been the success around that constitution writing and democracy building support that you gave to partners in Zimbabwe?
Oh, there's so many details associated with this, but let me kind of frame a higher level perspective. We understood that the constitution writing process was crucial because how it codified political, social, and economic rights would be so crucial to the future of the country, obviously. And we also understood that wasn't just a technical process, an expert-led process, although that was needed. And we believe that the support that we were giving to the community organizing also needs to be in tandem with support to NGOs with specific and deep experience in key areas. The best philanthropy is when you can support them in a coordinated way, where NGOs are even getting behind movements, getting behind community organizing, and understanding their relationship to it, not just operating in a vacuum. So we were most interested in the process of community organizing and participatory education around what a constitution is, what your rights are and should be, what you expect them to be, so that when a constitution is actually drafted and finalized, people see themselves in it. They understand how it serves their needs and rights, not just those of the elite. So we were very interested in the innovative work that the Zim Alliance was doing in community organizing around and leading up to the Constitution, as well as supporting specific meetings and convening and work on the part of legal experts, international human rights experts that were helping to feed direct input into the constitution making process.
Yeah, and of course, when speaking to most of the groups on the ground, this is one of the key successes of the Alliance, in the sense that not only was it just organizing, but it's also from a technical point of view. And the famous story is that of the late Alex Makaisa, who ended up being, the advisor of the Prime Minister, but one of the drafters of the Constitution, who specifically was supported through the Zim Alliance, through the Crisis Coalition. So that's one of the success points.
We're proud of that. We're very proud of that at Wallace Global Fund. We're very proud of that work because a small amount of our resources enabled that to happen. And we look back on that as one of the successes of the Zim Alliance and our ongoing funding to work for community organizing in Zimbabwe, which is in many ways what the Zim Alliance evolved to be.
Yeah, and of course, Ellen, we are speaking about community organizing, and I think, one of the other strands that really emerges out of this work is that of, the art community. So if you speak to groups that were working in the art space, either whether they are talking about Siangoba, Victory, Trust in Bulawayo, or those in Harare, the majority of them used art, film, drama, among others, to really rally the nation towards this inclusive growth, but towards this democratic path. And one of the successes, maybe not well known at the moment, is that some of the people who were in the art industry, they've actually pivoted to either becoming councillors in Zimbabwe or becoming members of parliament, partly because during that time they were doing the work on the ground. They got recognized by the communities, and they were bringing a different perspective. And so that's another strand of work where you are actually supporting art as a way of organizing in a country where organizing and gathering was not allowed, but you could actually have a concert, you could have performances by arts, and that's how, again, I think this work seemed to have channeled out. I don't know if you want to make any comments around the work that you are supporting on the art as a way of dealing with issues of democracy building, but also just this inclusive growth for a country like Zimbabwe.
Wallace Global Fund has always championed and tried to support artivism, the activism of artists. And it's not because they are powerful players in any kind of social movement, but it is that the method of connecting with people through culture, through film, through music and drama, and that it is a form of connection and communication that far exceeds our best rational efforts to design strategies and programs that mobilize people, that don't involve what unlocks your heart and connects with you through lived experience and shared experience. And so artivism we see as being absolutely vital to any social movement. And come on, we know that looking back through any successful movement in history, it was powered not solely, but powered by music and by drama. So we're committed to that just through the experiences and what is known about what works to connect with people, but also in repressive societies where activists in political organizations are being attacked and under fire and being oppressed or shut down completely or, imprisoned, killed. Culture becomes a vital way to infuse the kind of sense of efficacy about social change to empower people to act. Culture infuses wider, more broadly, and it is, let's be clear, much more difficult to target with state repression. So there's so many reasons to support cultural organizing, to support artivism. And that was one of the many things that made the Zim Alliance and the funding and the regranting and the organizing unique and distinct.
Another track on community organizing is that of various associations. In the main, you have your vendors and traders associations, you have your amalgamated teachers rural associations, among others. That also seemed to really play a huge function during that period in organizing what seemed to be local problems, but those problems were also national problems. For example, if you look at the rural teachers, it appears as if it's a rural teacher problem, but actually it was a national problem around teachers, which is why at the moment they are actually even representing teachers in the urban areas. If you look at traders and vendors associations, some of them have actually fed into the policy space in terms of the new policies, constructing new spaces where they are actually operating their businesses. So again, another form of organizing, which traditionally most donors would not look into, and Zim Alliance paid attention to that.
So I want to reflect on that in maybe a little bit different way. Yes, rural organizing is crucial. And that's one of the many reasons why we wanted to design with Trust Africa, with Briggs, with our other donor partners, something that was a little bit different, focused on, we started out as a funder civil society collaborative, not NGO collaborative. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't support NGOs, but in a country like Zimbabwe, anywhere in the world, in the United States, the amount of money that goes to NGOs that largely work in major cities are not getting to rural areas, not supporting the rural leaders and organizers, is so challenging. So we wanted to start out with an approach that would be civil society support. And the rural piece that Becky spoke about, yes, was critical. And I want to flag that is also a place where women are largely, proportionally, the organizers and leaders. They're addressing the problems of their family, they're addressing the problems of communities, and they're designing the solutions that all too often don't get the support they need. So yes, the Zim Alliance would get into rural communities. That was a way of supporting women's leadership, as well as supporting youth leadership. And the cultural piece became very important to organizing the youth. So that was a priority as well. Youth organizing, supporting women's leadership, going into rural communities. But if you think about, that's not just disparate funding, you need connective tissue. And that is what the staff, Briggs Bamba, and his partners provided, creating a fabric between the communities, amplifying up their needs and demands and strategies that they're advocating for, but also connecting them in an organizing methodology and creating ways to bring those youth, women-led rural communities into a national process. So over time, the Zim Alliance shifted the amount of resources that went to regranting to supporting organizing and processes of organizing, the community hubs, the mobilization around a citizens manifesto. These became tools for knitting together a movement of social change. And innovative, maybe not what we envisioned completely when we started out, but the point of the Alliance was to invest in that leadership, invest in experimentation, and ideally bring that back to the donors in a way that would inspire them, put more resources, scale it, and continue experimentation.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you have pivoted to the manifesto, because I was going to move there a little bit later, because I wanted us to look at another strand, which was the economic development part, where groups like ZimCode and others were also supported to work on issues around debt management. For example, there were groups that were also working on economic development, like Lendris and others. So it's not just the civil society broadly, like you are saying, but you also had a bit of NGOs that were part of that, those that were providing some technical issues around debt management and that. And so maybe we could speak a bit about that. Then I would want us to pivot to the Citizens Manifesto.
Well, first of all, just to repeat or clarify, getting resources to civil society wasn't maybe not traditionally structured ways of getting money to organizing, to building leadership, to engaging in the democratic change process, but also to support those NGOs that bring specific capacities and skills to that overall change agenda, so that it is in the best way possible happening in tandem or coordinated. And so that was true with the constitutional process, supporting NGOs that played a vital role, as well as civil society engagement and organizing. It's true in the economic agenda, where participatory education and community organizing around economic needs and economic change and economic policy, in partnership with specific NGOs doing that work, doing the policy work, doing the analysis, and themselves doing the kind of advocacy, required to advance policy change. So that work was all being supported. And Becky asked about one of the interesting processes was the Citizens Manifesto, which you've already interviewed many of the leaders that were involved in that, so we don't have to go through the details of it. But to me, that was extremely innovative, that it was creating a process which was nonpartisan. Let's be clear, it's all of this work is nonpartisan. It was a civil society driven process to document and elevate the demands and the expectations of what a government needs to provide for its people to meet economic, political, social rights. And it was an innovative organizing tool, a participatory model of education and organizing that I think is an incredible case study in its own right, that needs to be shared for other countries in similar processes of transition, let alone philanthropy. the Citizens Manifesto is one of the most innovative things that came out of this organizing work in Zimbabwe, as well as the social movement Baraza.
Yeah.
And I would love to talk about that.
Yeah, so I would want us to talk about that, but before we do that, so the Citizens Manifesto, of all the conversations that we held, is probably the leading story around the Zim Alliance, especially the cabinet, the Citizens Cabinet, and all the processes around community assemblies, leading all the way to the, to the national conference or convenings that were done. Yet, as we speak right now, most groups are asking, where is it? It seems to be dormant. So I'll be keen to hear from Briggs as well, but it sounds like it was the most innovative process of the Alliance. It was the most exciting. It's the one that most groups actually saw as something that they were all interested in and they participated fully, but it sounds to be dormant at the moment.
From my understanding and perspective, part of the challenge of that is resources. Because while much of the innovative work in Zimbabwe and in many other countries we work in, including in the United States, oftentimes the most innovative work didn't even begin with funding or had very limited funding. And we could have a whole dialogue about whether or not the revolution will be funded, because philanthropy orients towards the sort of established NGOs that can do great work, but really a change process that's power building and movement building often isn't resourced to at all, or even to become sustainable, durable, get to scale. So I think part of this is a funding issue. I also think that we have an opportunity to still continue to use the Citizens Manifesto. And so maybe one of the good things that'll come out of documenting the work in Zimbabwe is a recommendation that, based upon the interviews on the ground, there's a real hope that there is another, wave of organizing through the Citizen Manifesto process, and that this can still become a vital tool for advocacy. So it was a tool for organizing and advocacy, and it hit some kind of wall in the advocacy piece of it. So let's look at that and try and tackle that and see what we could do that's meaningful at this point, based upon the work that you're doing through this documentation.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that seem to come out of that process. So one of them is that one of the participants in this Zim manifesto and the cabinet was a group called Zim Rights, and they have actually come up with the Zimbabwe Human Rights Manifesto, which seems to have built from that. So that's one good element out of that. The second is that a number of people who seemed to participate in that process actually look at the grants and the question of resourcing. They look at the grants as having been catalytic, and they see this as potentially an opportunity for themselves as organizations to find ways of carrying this work forward, because the grants were really catalytic. They were never meant to stay forever. But the third component is this, some kind of pivoting to, social movements work. The Barazas, the first one starting in Harare, the second one in South Africa, and then we had another meeting in Dakar, and then of course there's one that's planned for next year. So maybe we could also talk about that evolution of the work from what seems to have been a local intervention in Zimbabwe, and now having some ramifications and implications for other parts of the world and other parts of the continent.
So over this 15-year period of engaging in Zimbabwe for Wallace Global Fund, again, we believe in experimentation. We believe in a trust-based philanthropy, that our partners know best what the effective strategies are. They need to come to us, and the closer we are to them, the better we understand what their needs are, to bring forward either new challenges or new opportunities. And over time, anything's going to evolve, the way it looks, the way it organizes, the methodologies. And so we understand that. So let's step back in that 15-year period. We are seeing new forms of organizing through social movements. Although social movements aren't new, social movements are what are essential to any real process of social change, social, economic, political change. They're not always the only component of social, political, and economic change. But philanthropy often is challenged by funding social movements because it's far easier to get resources one-to-one to an established NGO. But if you're really monitoring the trends in country, in the continent, you know that youth organizing is evolving and exploding. Women's community-based organizing is changing and shifting. And along with the growth in Pan-African identity, you start seeing Pan-African movement organizing. And we have been funding other efforts around Pan-African organizing, women's rights organizing, feminist organizing across the continent. So through the work in Zim and the support we were giving to Zim Alliance, we understood this shifting process had implications in Zimbabwe, or we understood it from Zimbabwe. And we began some discussions with Briggs about the need to convene and share strategies of social movement organizing, and to look at some of the things that Zimbabwe faced, but also the innovations in Zimbabwe, and share them with other movement organizing and community organizing happening across Africa. That was one of the kernels that led to the first social movement Baraza. As Becky said, it happened in Harare, and what we also did was schedule a funder track to bring funders in, maybe that weren't investing in Zimbabwe, or maybe were investing in one or two NGOs in Zimbabwe and in other parts of Africa, to see and learn from these leaders that were organizing in different ways, doing community organizing, connecting community organizing across geographies and sectors, and tied to, NGO support. So the first Baraza was actually one of the more interesting things I think we ever funded at Wallace Global Fund. And I was very privileged to be there, and was so incredibly inspired, not just by the incredibly creative and courageous leaders that were there, sharing their stories of organizing under some of the most extreme conditions of repression, and how positive, visionary, how it filled with a sense of profound efficacy, that even under the most challenging conditions, if you mobilize people and you bring them together into a process where they see their own agency, and they see how in what they see is their little world, their activism in that space is having an impact, and it is having an impact because it's part of a hydra-headed movement that is having impacts in other places, and are connecting and building power and building a force that is unstoppable and can stand up to the elite abuses of power, to the elite corruption, to the elite failure to meet the basic needs and rights of people on the ground. So the Baraza, to me, is one of the interesting, innovative spokes that comes out of the hub of the work in Zimbabwe. And it's only one piece, but it is the piece that's connected to the continent-wide transition processes and opportunities and social movement organizing and Pan-African social movement organizing.
So, Ellen, let me ask you and say, in these 15 years, I don't want to say what has the intervention taught the fund, but maybe what are the lessons that you would want to reflect on over these 15 years? I mean, some of them could be around the governance and management of the alliance. I mean, collaborations are not as easy as we think they are. What have been the lessons around that? But there are also lessons around, just this idea that you start with certain objectives, but over time those objectives change, and the strategies and tactics also shift. We are now talking about, the Baraza, but we started with the re-granting facility, and all those. So what are the lessons that have emerged for you as the fund, and for you personally as the person that has been involved since day one?
I think there's so many lessons, and we've reflected on them internally. We're glad we've tried to document them for ourselves, share them with other donors many times. Briggs and I and Becky, we've been involved in panels and discussions and try and promote this to other funders. And some of the things you set out to do that don't happen are worth evaluating why they didn't happen. And I would say one of the things that didn't happen is we didn't really function as a community of practice of donors. And I think that says a lot more about philanthropy and how it operates than what the Zim Alliance did. I think the Zim Alliance tried to create that platform or community of practice among the donors. We did it informally among the kind of like-minded donors, but sometimes some of the bigger donors came in with a very specific agenda and funded that. They weren't really interested in the experiment of the Zim Alliance. They weren't maybe as interested in the community organizing approach. So that was one lesson, that it's hard to herd philanthropy cats. Another lesson is that it pays to be experimental, and it pays to listen to what is happening and the needs of your partners as defined by your partners. At this moment, we need to intervene in the constitutional process. And we want to do a community organizing piece. We want to do a more technical intervention on drafting the Constitution so it's the strongest possible instrument for human rights. At this moment, we want to begin this innovative Citizens Manifesto as a participatory organizing strategy. And at this moment, we feel like we need to connect with the Pan-African social movement organizing. You experiment and you let it evolve, and you assess at various points in time whether these experiments are working and worth putting much deeper resources into, or whether you say maybe this isn't, it was good, we learned from it, but maybe we don't carry this on. We learn that from the leaders we trust. So that reinforces the trust-based philanthropy, where you trust the leadership and they communicate effectively. Sometimes that works. Then you have the confidence to continue that sustained and durable funding, which is vital.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ellen, for those reflections. I mean, if somebody were to say, what are the things that you would do differently if you were to re-travel the 15 years, what would those things be?
What will we do differently? I think think I got a little frustrated with organizing philanthropy. It's hard. And there's a lot of money in US philanthropy now. And that money sometimes is so big that it works in an inverse relationship to actually getting transformative organizing at scale. Because to fund movements means you have to be investigating how to get money in a way that gets to community organizing and advocacy and movement building. You have to have a capacity to be on the ground, either there directly or with trusted partners. And it's a lot easier for philanthropy to fund NGOs, just directly large NGOs. And the more money funders have, the more they're going to do that because they can't discharge their resources fast enough or appropriately enough. So it means big tranches of money goes to NGOs. And so on the one, how did this affect Zimbabwe? Zimbabwe wasn't on the radar to begin with. It wasn't a country that had risen in global philanthropy to being a priority place. As I said earlier, designated as a transitional society, which means we believe that if we put money in, democracy will happen. Stir it up, happens, which of course is silly. And not understanding that starving the country of resources that could go to community organizing, movement building, a change process that could succeed was a fait accompli. So the combination of Zimbabwe not rising here and so much money in philanthropy that when it does come to a country like Zimbabwe, it's going to go in big chunks to NGOs. So part of what we need to do with this case study of the Zim Alliance and the funding and the organizing work in Zimbabwe is to show that it can be done if a small foundation with limited resources and no staff in Southern Africa can play a role that achieved many of the successes, the constitutional change process, the Constitution itself, the organizing on the ground, the connective tissue of the Citizens Manifesto. If you can do that with a little bit of money, with trusted partners, trust Africa, and trusted partners and leaders on the ground, why can't the larger foundations do that? So for me, one of the things that I think was a failure was our failure at Wallace Global Fund not to build that bigger tent of funders. We tried. We tried by forming this as a funder civil society collaborative. We tried even hiring a consultant, working with us to go and kind of reach out to what we thought were the funder partners. We did bring other partners in, and we did have dedicated funding. Sometimes it was very specific funding that didn't work in that experimental organizing way.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest. I would also say there's always lessons learned about, hey, the governance, could this have been different? Could we have communicated this differently? You know, did we really interrogate whether this was the best funding versus that? That doesn't, none of that worries me. That's part of the sausage making.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm glad that we're ending on a very positive note, because one of the biggest gatherings that has ever happened in the country, I'm told, was a gathering when Kofi Annan and the elders actually came to Harare, and the Harare Gardens was so full and occupied, and most activists and groups in Zimbabwe say they have never seen any event like that since then. And that was Kofi Annan's last official visit before he passed on. So that's Zim Alliance that brought him to the country.
Yeah. How could I have forgotten that? I forgot that.
Yeah.
And that was explicitly done with our partners. Some of the human rights organizations, the elders themselves, but that process of inviting them in came directly from the work of our partners in Zimbabwe and Briggs's leadership. Completely forgot, because we were also working on bringing international solidarity to Zimbabwe. We didn't really talk about that. Part of what the funders who were aligned in funding the grassroots work and the change process in Zimbabwe worked to try and bring some greater international solidarity inside the country, to elevate the change process and to push back against the repression, and also solidarity for the partners in Zimbabwe, especially in times of repression, to create conditions which would bring international spotlight and visibility, which is one of the tools to fight back against repression. So the elders visit was such a wonderful thing. I wish I'd been there personally, but all the photos and everything I saw about it was so exciting. We were thrilled by it. There were other efforts, an activist here trying to bring their case to Amnesty International or other networks of human rights support globally we would do. That's just part of being a comrade funder, is that you constantly think about the ways to bring technical, material, global political mobilization to your partners.
Yeah, and obviously one of the youngest MPs right now in the country, Takuzwa, is a product of Zim Alliance. He was a student coordinator of Zinasu. He was an intern at Zim Alliance and is now a member of parliament. So another positive product of the Zim Alliance.
Youth leadership and youth organizing has been one of the cross-cutting theories of change for Wallace Global Fund. We are proud of all of the support of youth organizing in Africa, young women organizing, the youth organizers in Zimbabwe, the anti-fossil fuel activists, youth activists. We have invested in their strategies. So the fossil fuel divestment movement led to the Green New Deal, which led to the first significant climate legislation in the United States. Fund youth leadership, fund it at scale, and change happens. It's so simple.
So, Ellen, I want us to end by sparing a thought on staff that operate in Zimbabwe, the Zim Alliance staff, because, doing grant making and funding in a country like Zimbabwe is not that easy. So, of course, there are so many stars in terms of the partners, in terms of the activists themselves. But the staff themselves work in a day in and day out in a context like Zimbabwe. And I actually visited the office about 2 weeks ago, and just marveled at the work that they are doing. But obviously, working in a country where they are always vigilant about the kind of work that they are doing.
You can't say enough about the quality of the staff, the Trust Africa staff based in Zimbabwe and doing the work in Zimbabwe. And I can only hope that the Trust Africa board understands the quality of staff that they have, that are doing phenomenal organizing, are providing the kind of needed, immediate, urgent support to their partners, who are communicating that work, and have, quite frankly, very little financial support, and on a daily basis put their own lives at stake for playing that role. We couldn't be more proud of that leadership, that staff leadership, because they're not just staff. They are activists in their own right, committed to their partners, committed to the success of their partners, and committed to the safety of their partners. So it's an extraordinary team from, I hope you're interviewing all of them, not just Briggs. Briggs leads that team, but over time, even staff that have left tend to sign. Amazing capacities. So I think it's important that we always elevate those staff that are doing the change work, see themselves as serving movements, not just being in the gilded position of working in philanthropy. That's what we need, is staff that understand they serve movements. And it is an extraordinary privilege to do so. That's how I feel about work in Zim.
Yeah, it's some form of sacrifice that I think colleagues do make. But talking about sacrifice, I'm also told that part of the Zim Alliance journey involved Kumi and Nomboniso going on some hunger strike in the early beginnings in solidarity with the Zimbabwe situation.
That was the earliest days.
Yeah.
Kumi's hunger strike. That was, I'm trying to recall what the actual date of that was, but the hunger strike was vital to that international spotlight, which I would flag, I don't think we built enough of that international solidarity. It was hard, but to have that hunger strike be amplified was vital in the early days.
Yeah.
I hope that you'll talk to them. And their early reasons for doing that, their reasons for doing that and documenting that would be really, really great, Becky. I hope you guys will do that.
Yeah, we'll try and reach out to both of them. I'm sure Kumi will avail himself. Definitely, he's been part of the journey till now. So, Ellen, as we end, I've really been fascinated by the story of Zim Alliance. It's been more of a celebration, actually, than challenges and barriers. Is there anything that you want to add before we stop the conversation on Zim Alliance?
Yes. Wallace Global Fund made a principled decision to spend down. We believe that if you really, really believe the science of climate change, and you understand that there is a timeline based on physics, and if you really believe that democracy is under siege around the world and in the United States, it didn't seem right to only pay out 5% of our assets on an annual basis. And by the way, most of philanthropy, even if they stay in perpetuity, can pay out a lot more than 5%. They're sitting on investment banks. So we made the decision to spend down. We did not do that lightly because we understand there are key pieces of work that our departure from the field would leave a void. A lot of our work, there's other donors. We partner with them to leverage their funding. They'll fill the void as we leave the field. But our work in Zimbabwe is one of the areas where we are quite concerned about our sustained and durable funding will not be replaced. So our commitment over the next 3 years when we spend down is really to try and figure out how to bring other donors in that can substitute for our funding and our role, not just an occasional check, but that kind of sustained funding. So what I want to say is that this project of documenting the Zim Alliance and what it led to, because it evolved, becomes a tool for recruiting other donors, individual donors, small donors, large donors, endowed foundations, to come in, support the amazing work of the people in Zimbabwe, and fund a true process of change. No country is dispensable.
Ellen, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this useful and insightful reflections on the journey of the Zimbabwe Alliance, but also on the role that you yourself personally, Scott, and others have played, but most importantly, the fund and the support that it has given to Zimbabwean partners, especially those that have taken part in the journey of the Alliance. Thank you so much.
Becky, one soundbite you'll fill me for. When we talk about Wallace Global Fund supporting this work, it is our entire board. Our board members have gone to Zimbabwe. Our board members have championed the constitutional process. Our board members see this as one of the most innovative and important things we've done. Wallace Global Fund board and staff are a team. And so I'm proud to have worked for an institution that was willing to be innovative, experimental, support social movements, and that came from the very top.
Thank you so much, Ellen, to you, and our appreciation to the entire staff, to the board, to the family. Thank you so much. That was Ellen Dorsey, the former executive director of the Wallace Global Fund and currently the senior advisor with the fund. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.